Diddy's name once carried weight, that no one dared challenge the mogul who conquered the music industry, built empires, and amassed a fortune that most could only dream of. He had it all: success, power, influence. His name was synonymous with luxury and excess, the embodiment of the American dream for many. But behind the glitz and glamour of his empire there was a side of Diddy that the public had never seen, a side that would soon come to light in a courtroom that would change everything. It all started with the rumors, whispers about business dealings gone wrong, about shady relationships, and about a man who had built his wealth on the backs of others. Some claimed that Diddy had made deals with people who were just as willing to break the rules as he was. Others speculated about the darker side of his success, the price he had paid for his empire. No one could ignore the stories forever, and eventually they caught up with him. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to see the spectacle, the drama, and the inevitable fall of one of the world's biggest icons. It was an atmosphere unlike any other, a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and skepticism. Would Diddy walk away from this, or would the truth come crashing down, revealing a side of him that no one had anticipated? The world was waiting, and Diddy knew this trial would decide not just his fate, but also the future of his career, his reputation, and everything he had worked for. Diddy sat in the courtroom, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. The man who was used to being in control, who always had the world at his fingertips, now looked like a man completely out of his element. His legal team was trying their best to maintain the facade of confidence, but Diddy knew deep down that this wasn't just an antitherbismus deal. This wasn't a quick fix he could buy his way out of. This was real. This was about accountability. This was about everything he had built crashing down if the wrong verdict was handed down. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now, let's get back to it. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the charges against Diddy were serious allegations of financial misconduct, abuse of power, and unethical business practices had all come to light. The prosecution was relentless, pulling in evidence that painted Diddy not as a successful mogul, but as someone who hated his power and influence for his own benefit, no matter the cost. They painted him as a man willing to do whatever it took to maintain his empire, even if it meant crossing legal and moral lines. The accusations were damning, and Diddy's legal team worked overtime to counteract them, to convince the court that he was innocent, that his success had been built through hard work and legitimate business practice. But there was something in the air that told Diddy that this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another legal battle. There was something deeper at play here, something that was beginning to chip away at the walls he had built around himself over the years. His defense team could only do so much to protect him from the growing sense that truth, whatever it was about to be exposed. And in the back of his mind, Diddy knew that the longer this dragged on, the harder it would be to maintain the image of the man he had worked so hard to create. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. The media frenzy outside the courtroom was overwhelming. Every move, every glance, every word was scrutinized. The people who had unseated him were now questioning his every action, every decision he had made. It wasn't just the trial that was on the line, it was his entire legacy. The empire he had spent years building could crumble if the jury found him guilty of even one of the charges against him. His public image, the persona that he had carefully curated, was at risk of being destroyed. And then came the day that will change everything. Diddy was called to the stand. The courtroom went silent. World outside paused. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on charisma, savvy, and street-smart instincts was about to speak. For the first time, all eyes were on him. The tension in the room was palpable. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Diddy barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere. He had always been able to control the narrative, shape the story to fit his needs, but this was different. This wasn't something he could control with money, power, or charm. This was about facing the truth, something he hadn't done in years. He wasn't just facing the court, he was facing himself as he took the stand. Diddy looked out over the courtroom. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, and his own defense team were all waiting for him to speak, and for the first time in a long time, Diddy wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't the confident mogul anymore. He wasn't the man who could charm his way out of anything, no. Today he had to be someone else, a man willing to admit his mistakes, to own up to the things he hadn't. This was the moment that would define him. This was the moment that would change everything. Diddy took a deep breath as the room fell into a heavy silence. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, the weight of expectation hanging in the air. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms sweaty, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This was it. This was the moment where everything could change for Yersh. Had built an empire, a legacy, and now everything he had worked for was at risk. Had been untouchable, the king of his world, the mogul. Everyone looked up to you in this moment. All that power seemed so far away in that courtroom. He was just another man facing the consequence of his actions. The prosecutor's eyes were cold, calculating. Diddy had seen that look before in the faces of people who wanted to bring him down. They had their accusations. Financial misconduct, fraudulent practices, abuse of power. They had their evidence, carefully laid out to paint him as a criminal who had used his empire to exploit others, and now they were waiting for him to speak. The pressure was suffocating. His lawyer gave him a subtle nod, signaling it was his time to take the stand. Diddy cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. The microphone in front of him was cold, but it felt like it was burning into his skin. His hands shook slightly as he placed them on the desk, trying to steady himself. He wasn't just defending himself in this moment, he was defending everything he had ever worked for. He had been in many battles before, but this was different. This time it wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about facing something deeper, something he had been avoiding for years. Diddy looked out over the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting the gaze of the jury. They were all waiting for him to speak, to explain himself. But how do you explain the unexplainable? How do you justify a lifetime of decisions, some good and some bad, when the stakes are this high? He had spent years building his empire by any means necessary, but no, those very means were being questioned. It wasn't just his career on the line. It was his reputation, his legacy, his identity. The prosecutor leaned forward, eyes narrowing, waiting for him to crack. Diddy could feel the weight of their gaze, but he refused to be intimidated. He wasn't the same man he had been years ago. The bravado that once defined him was now replaced with a quiet resolve. He had made mistakes, yes, wasn't perfect, but in this moment Diddy understood that facing the truth wasn't a weakness, it was the only way out. He straightened in his chair and took a deep breath. Your Honor. He began, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that surprised even him. I've spent my life trying to build something, to leave a legacy behind. Beauty'll be the first to admit not all of the choices I made were the right ones, not all of them were clean, and that's something I've had to live with. There was a murmur in the courtroom. The judge's eyes flickered over to the prosecution, but Diddy didn't look away from them. He was done hiding behind the persona. For once he wasn't the man I expected him to be. He wasn't playing the game anymore. This was real, this was raw. I've done things, he continued, his voice becoming a little rougher, that I'm not proud of. I've made deals that weren't best. I've made choices that have hurt people. I care about people who trusted me, and for that, I'm sorry. His words hung in the air, a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. The prosecutor's smug expression faltered, and for a brief moment the tension in the courtroom seemed to shift. Diddy glanced briefly at his defense team. They looked worried, unsure of how the jury would take his confession, but he didn't care about that anymore. He wasn't here to play it safe or try to twist the narrative he had spent so many years running from. His mistakes hiding behind his image, that he had forgotten who Hirali was beneath it all. In this moment, standing in front of the judge and jury, he was finally seeing himself for who Hirali was, not the untouchable mogul, but a man who had made mistakes and wasting to own them. I'm not asking for sympathy, Diddy said, his voice quieter, now almost softer. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to tell you who I am now, who I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to fix the things I've broken, but I need you to understand that I can't change unless I face the truth about myself, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm facing it. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. Diddy's confession had hitherto than anyone expected. His defense team had no idea he was going to say that, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in years, Diddy was no longer the man who could manipulate a situation, no longer the man who could control the narrative. He had laid it all out there, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't sure what the next steps Would but for the first time he felt like he had nothing left to hide. As Diddy finished speaking, he could feel the weight in the room shift. The eyes of the jury were no longer filled with judgment. There was something else there now, maybe respect. Maybe understanding, but it was something that hadn't been there before. It was a strange feeling to be seen for woe. He truly was not for the persona he had built for himself, but it was a feeling he could finally breathe into. He sat back in his chair, his heart still racing. The prosecutor didn't know what to say. The defense team looked at him with a mix of confusion and pride. But Diddy didn't need their approval. He had just done something that none of them had expected. He had told the truth. And no, whatever happened next, at least he knew he had started down a path where he didn't have to hide anymore. The courtroom was still, the silence thick with the weight of Diddy's words. The confession had been unexpected, raw, and left everyone in the room with something to think about. His team, still reeling from the shock, sat motionless, unsure of the jury would respond. The prosecution, who had expected Diddy to continue denying or deflecting, now had to recalibrate. But Diddy knew that whatever happened next, it couldn't be undone. He had spoken his truth, something that felt more freeing than he could have ever anticipated. Yet the road ahead was still uncertain, and he couldn't escape the realization that the battle was far from over. The judge leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room, thewed of the moment not lost on him. He had witnessed countless trials in his career, but there was something different about this one. Diddy was a powerful figure, and seeing him expose his vulnerabilities was a rarity, especially in a courtroom. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady. "Mr. Combs, I understand the gravity of your statement, but the court requires a full examination of the facts. This confession does not absolve you of the charges against you. We still must proceed with the trial." Diddy nodded. He knew that the trial wasn't over, that his admission, however powerful, didn't change the legal proceedings. The prosecution, who had been waiting for this moment to exploit any sign of weakness, was quick to pounce. The lead prosecutor stood and approached the bench, his voice sharp as he addressed the judge and the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, high size now fixed on Diddy, "you have heard the defendant's words. He admits to mistakes, but that is not enough. His confession is an attempt to manipulate the court to gain your sympathy, to paint himself as a victim, when in reality he has exploited those around him to climb to the top. He wants to show you a side of himself that is just another fabrication. Do not let this confession cloud your judgment." Diddy sat there listening to the prosecutor's words, but this time something was different. He didn't feel defensive for the first time, felt completely unburdened by the lies, the facades, and the persona he had worn for so many years. He wasn't the man they were trying to paint him as. He was just a man who had made mistakes, owned up to them, and was trying to move forward. He glanced at his defense team, hoping they would interject, but it was clear that they were processing the gravity of what he had just done. The room was heavy with the weight of Diddy's confession, and the jury seemed to be divided. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with skepticism. The tension was palpable. The prosecution wasn't done. They continued to drive home their point, reiterating that Diddy's confession didn't change the evidence they had against him. The facts, they argued, were clear. He had used his power and influence to manipulate situations in his favor. His success had come at the expense of others, and now he was attempting to use his admission to escape the consequences of his actions. Diddy felt his pulse quicken. His defense lawyer stood in motion for a brief recess as the courtroom slowly untied for the break. Diddy remained seated, his hands folded tightly on the desk in front of him. The air felt heavy. His lawyer, usually calm and composed, leaned over and whispered in his ear, "You did well, Diddy, but we need to be careful. We can't let them twist this." Diddy nodded but said nothing. His lawyer's words didn't bring him comfort. They reminded him of the storm that was still brewing. This was just the beginning. The confession might have been the hardest part, but now the real battle was about to begin. How would he be judged? Would jury see him as a man who was finally willing to confront his past, or would they see him as someone trying to manipulate the system? As the recess dragged on, Diddy's thoughts turned inward. He thought about his rise to mammoth mistakes he had made along the way, the people he had wronged, and the things he had sacrificed in the name of success. His empire, built on the backs of others, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, in this moment of reckoning, did he realize something that was both terrifying and freeing? The person he had been, the person who had made those choices, was not the man he was today. He had spent so long hiding from the truth that he had almost forgotten who he really was, but now, in the most vulnerable moment of his life, he finally saw the truth. Diddy wasn't the man who had built an empire through manipulation and greed. He wasn't the man who had hurt people to get ahead. He was a man who had made mistakes, yes, but he was also someone who had learned that success wasn't worth the cost of his soul. The jury returned and the trial resumed. Diddy straightened up, his thoughts cleared, and for the first time in a long time he felt a sense of purpose. The next steps would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. He had confessed, he had owned his mistakes, and now, whatever happened, he could face it with the knowledge that he had done something few ever had the courage to do. He had faced the truth. Not for any O'Neills, but for himself. The courtroom hummed with an energy that felt almost electric, the tension rising higher with each passing minute. Diddy sat still, his eyes fixed forward, his face unreadable. Prosecution had done its job presenting the damning evidence against him. His confession had opened the door to a new level of complexity in the case, but what would happen next was out of his hands. The jury, now in the spotlight, was staring at him, and Diddy felt the weight of their gaze. More than ever, each one of them had a job to do, to sift through the truth, to evaluate what they had heard, and to decide if his moment of vulnerability was enough to make them reconsider the case against him. The judge called for a brief recess, allowing everyone a moment to collect themselves. Diddy's legal team huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, trying to strategize. The pressure was mounting. Hislawire, the one person who had believed in him through thick and thin, approached him slowly, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "You're doing the right thing, Diddy, but now we need to make sure the jury sees this for what it is," his lawyer said, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one overheard. "We need to frame your confession. This isn't about guilt or innocence anymore, it's about who you are. Now they need to understand that." Diddy nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know, I just don't know if it'll be enough." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of everything he had said still fresh in his mind. He had exposed himself in ways he hadn't even thought possible, but now he was left with the aftermath, hoping that the truth would be enough to set him free, yet fearful that the damage might already be done. The recess ended, and the room filled with the rustling of papers, the shuffle of shoes, and the soft murmurs of the audience. As they returned to their seats, Diddy didn't look up. He didn't need to. He already knew that every eye in the room was on him, waiting for the next act in this courtroom drama to unfold. The pressure of being in the spotlight had never been more suffocating. The judge gave a quick nod, and the proceedings continued. It was the prosecution's turn to speak. They stood confidently, their attorney's voice cutting through the room with precision. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the defendant's admission, and yes, while it's commendable that Mr. Combs has chosen to come forward with his truth, let us not lose sight of the facts. This confession, no matter how heartfelt, does not change the severity of his actions. His empire was built on the backs of others. His success was built on exploitation, and now it is time for him to answer for that." The prosecutor paused, allowing the words to sink in. Diddy could feel the weight of their accusation. They had taken his confession and turned it into a weapon. It was no longer about the mistakes he had made, it was about using them to confirm their narrative. He could feel the heat of their gaze, but he refused to flinch. "They may try to tell you a different story, that Mr. Combs is a changed man," the prosecutor continued, his voice sharp and measured, "but let's be clear, a confession does not absolve guilt, and actions, as we know, speak louder than words. His admission may be a step toward personal redemption, but it does not change the law. It does not change the evidence. The only thing that matters now is the truth of his actions, the lives he's ruined, and the systems he's exploited." Diddy could hear the murmurs of the jury, the shifting of their seats, the faint scribbling of notes. He couldn't look at them now. He couldn't risk seeing the judgment in their eyes. He focused on the prosecutor's words, instead letting them wash over him. They were painting him as the villain, as a man who had manipulated and discarded the very people who had helped him rise. As the prosecution finished their speech, Diddy's defense attorney rose to his feet, standing tall in front of the jury. The defense lawyer's voice was calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that this case is about more than just the law. It's about understanding who Mr. Combs is today. Yes, he made mistakes, he admits that, but that doesn't make him a criminal. We're all human, we all falter, but it's not about the mistakes. you've made. It's about what you do after, how you redeem yourself, and how you choose to face those mistakes. Mr. Combs has done just that. He's taken full responsibility and he's asking for a chance to make things right. The defense attorney's words hung in the air, and Diddy felt a small spark of hope. His confession had opened the door for the defense to argue his case from a different angle. He wasn't just a man on trial for his past mistakes. He was a man trying to change, trying to rebuild. Wade had broken, and maybe that would be enough, but it wasn't over yet. The prosecutor, sensing a shift in momentum, wasn't done. He stood and made his final remarks. Let's not forget that Mr. Combs' actions didn't just affect him, they affected the lives of countless people who trusted him, who believed in him. And while we can admire his courage for coming forward, we must not let that cloud the fact that this is still a matter of the law. What he did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. His actions hurt people, and now he must answer for it. He could feel the weight of their words, the consequences pressing on him, but he also felt something else. He wasn't just the man they were accusing. He was someone more, a man who had come forward when no one thought he would, a man who had owned up to his mistakes. The outcome of this trial was still uncertain, but Diddy wasn't the same man who walked into that courtroom weeks ago. Had faced his past, and no matter what happened, that was something no one could take from him. The judge called for a brief break, allowing both sides to prepare for the final arguments. As the courtroom emptied, Diddy sat in his chair, looking out at the sea of faces, trying to prepare for what was coming next. He had done what he could. Now it was out of his hands, but he felt for the first time in his life that he could finally breathe. He had exposed his truth, and that was something no one could ever take from him. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Diddy's confession had shocked everyone, but now as the trial neared its final moments, there was a sense of unease hanging over him. He sat still, hands clasped tightly in front of him, trying to focus, trying to drown out the noise that was rising all around him. The weight of the world was pressing down on him, and it wasn't just about the outcome of this trial. It was about everything he had ever built, everything he had lost, and everything he had to prove. The defense team had rallied after his emotional confession, but the prosecution wasn't giving up. They were relentless, and Diddy knew it. They would dig into every word he had spoken, twisting his sincerity into something else, using it against him. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over until the jury spoke, and even then the consequences of his actions could haunt him for years to come. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the return from recess. Diddy stood slowly, his legs heavy, his mind racing. His lawyer whispered a few quick words to him before stepping up to address the court. The prosecution had already delivered their final arguments, painting Diddy as a man who was seeking sympathy, trying to manipulate the system with his confession. Now it was the defense's turn to reclaim the narrative, to show that Diddy wasn't just a man who made mistakes, but a man who had learned, who had truly faced the consequences and was ready to change. As Diddy's lawyer spoke, laying out their case, Diddy tried to hold on to something inside him, some piece of hope. He had made mistakes, that much was undeniable, but he was here now, trying to rebuild what he had broken. Hewan asking for forgiveness, but for a chance to show he could do better, for a chance to prove that the man in the courtroom today was not the same man who had made those choices in the past. We're not asking you to forget the mistakes of past, the defense lawyer said, his voice firm, measured. What we're asking you to do is look at the man standing bare you today. Look at the man who has admitted his wrongdoings, who has faced his past head on, and who is doing everything he can to make it right. A man who has lost everything but still stands here, still willing to fight for redemption. Diddy watched his lawyer closely, knowing that this was his last chance to make the jury see him for what he was trying to become, not just the successful mogul, but the person he had grown into through his hardships. The confession had been his first step, and now he needed the jury to understand that he wasn't just playing a part. This was real. This was the truth. The prosecutor stood up, interrupting the defense lawyer's final remarks. He wasted no time, his voice cutting through their confident and sharp. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, don't be fooled by the words you've just heard, the prosecutor said. Yes, Mr. Combs has admitted to some mistakes, but that's all it is. Words meant to cloud your judgment, words meant to make you feel sympathy for him, to make you forget about the harm he's caused, the people he's hurt, the power he's abused, his empire, his wealth. None of it came from honesty or integrity. It came from manipulation. It came from greed, and it came from using others to get ahead. He sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrest. He could feel his heart racing again, the pressure of it all crashing down on him. The prosecution had no mercy. They were relentless, intent in turning every moment in the trial against him. He knew that his confession wouldn't erase the damage, but he hoped it would be enough to show the jury that he wasn't just a villain. He was a man who had acknowledged his faults, who had faced his demons, and who was trying to change. The jury sat in silence, their faces unreadable. Some of them were taking notes, others were looking down lost in thought. Diddy couldn't read them, couldn't tell if they saw him as he saw himself, a man who had learned, who had been broken, and was now trying to rebuild, or if they saw him as the prosecution had painted him, a man whose success had been built on the backs of others, a man who had used his influence and power for his own gain. The final arguments came and went, but Diddy couldn't focus on the words anymore. It was too much to process, too much to feel. What if they didn't believe him? What if his admission wasn't enough? Had laid bare his soul, confessed his mistakes, and exposed the man behind the empire, but the question remained. Was it enough to convince them? Was it enough to rebuild everything he had lost? The judge called for the jury to deliberate, and Diddy's heart sank. He had done all he could. Now all that was left was to wait. The courtroom emptied slowly, the jurors filing out, the reporters packing up, allies turning away from him, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He didn't know how long he sat there, his mind running over everything, the trial, the confession, his past. It was all a blur now, but one thing was crystal clear: no matter what happened next, the man he was now, the man who had stood before that court and admitted his mistakes, would never be the same man again. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the jury deliberated. Every second felt like an eternity. Diddy sat in the same chair where he had made his emotional confession, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his mind racing through every moment that had led to this. He couldn't shake the thought of his empire crumbling piece by piece, no matter how much he had tried to fix it. This was a defining moment in his life, and as much as he wanted to look forward, he couldn't help but feel haunted by the past. It wasn't just the legal ramifications that weighed heavily on him. It was everything had built his legacy, his career, his reputation, now under the harshest scrutiny. The world had been watching him, dissecting every move, every word. His confession had left him exposed in a way he had never imagined. In the span of just a few days, Diddy had gone from being the most powerful figure in the music industry to a man on trial for his life, a man who had been brought down by his own actions. His defense attorney sat next to him, flipping through notes, but there was a quiet unease in his posture too. The moment Diddy had stepped forward and admitted to his mistakes, the strategy of the entire case had shifted. Now, it wasn't just about innocence. It was about redemption. It was about whether the jury could see past the mistakes of his past and recognize the man he was trying to become. His attorney glanced over, catching Diddy's eyes, but didn't say anything. What could be said? The waiting was killing them both. The door to the jury room opened, and the foreperson of the jury stepped in, followed by the rest of the jurors. Diddy's heart skipped a beat. The air seemed to grow heavier. The foreperson walked up to the judge, handing over the verdict, and for a split second everything in the room came to a standstill. The entire courtroom held its breath. The judge glanced at the paper, looked over at the prosecution, then at the defense. He raised his hand and signaled for everyone to quiet down. Diddy's eyes locked onto the judge as the room held its collective breath. His fate and the fate of his empire were about to be sealed. Mr. Combs, the judge began, his voice cutting through the tension. The jury has returned with a verdict. Will the defendant please arise? Diddy stood slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. His hands felt cold, his heart thundering in his chest. He didn't know if he was ready for this moment, if he could handle the weight off what was about to happen. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, each day filled with its own set of fears and hopes, but now this was it. There was no going back. The foreperson spoke, their voice steady but firm. We, the jury, find the defendant Sean Combs guilty of charges presented. Diddy felt the world tilt, his breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, everything around him blurred. His mind couldn't process the words guilty. He had hoped for a different outcome, had thought his confession might sway the jury in his favor, but now standing there hearing the words, he feared most. Everything seemed to fall apart in front of him, his empire, his legacy, everything He had fought for felt like it was crumbling to dust. The judge continued, however, the jury has also recommended leniency in sentencing Gaknong. The defendant's cooperation and his willingness to face his past head on Diddy's body went numb. Weight of the words was too much to bear guilty, but there was a sliver of hope. The jury had recognized his effort to change, to atone for his wrongs. They had seen the man he was trying to become, not just the one he had been, and yet even with this recognition the reality was undeniable. He had lost the courtroomful into a soft murmur as the judge continued to lay out the next steps. Diddy's defense attorney leaned in, whispering something in his ear, but Diddy couldn't focus on anything except the weight of the verdict. The future felt uncertain, shrouded in the haze of his past mistakes and the long road to recovery. The judge finally looked up. His gaze direct. Mr. Combs, this court will deliberate further on your sentencing and the appropriate measures will be decided. However, I urge you to take this moment seriously. The actions that led you here have consequences, but your willingness to face them will not go unnoticed. As Diddy sat back down, heckled, feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, the reporters, the jurors, telewires, they were all watching, waiting for his reaction. The weight of firmament pressed down on him, and for the first time in years Diddy didn't know who he was. The man in the mirror had changed, and now he was left to figure out what came next. Could he rebuild? Could he truly redeem himself in the eyes of the world, or was this the end of the road for him? He looked at his defense team, but the questions swirling in his mind were too many. The confession had been his way of trying to change a trying to make things right, but the road ahead seemed darker than ever as the courtroom began to clear out. Did remained seated, lost in thought. The battle was far from over. The jury had spoken, but the real fight was just beginning. Would he rise from this, or was this the beginning of his final fall? Only time would tell. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom as Diddy sat motionless in his seat. The weight of the verdict still hung heavy in the air. Had been found guilty, but there was still a glimmer of hope, a faint chance of redemption. The jury had acknowledged his efforts to own up to his mistakes, to confront the man he had been. But as he sat there, trying to process what had just happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed forever. His empire, his reputation, everything he had built, none of it seemed secure anymore. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the buzz of anticipation, now felt like a hollow shell of the world he had once ruled. The defense team remained quietly by his side, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and determination. They had fought hard to shift the narrative in Diddy's favor, but now it was up to the judge to decide his fate. The court had seen him as both a man of mistakes and a man trying to make amends, but would that be enough? Could the public, the media, the world at large ever truly forgive him? The media had already begun its analysis. Headlines were flashing everywhere. Did he found guilty but seeks redemption? Theft fall of a mogul. Did he face his consequences? The world had watched his rise, and now they were watching his fall. Weight of those stares, those judgments was suffocating. Diddy had always thrived under the spotlight, but no, it felt like it was choking him as the judge prepared to give the final ruling on his sentence. Diddy's mind flashed back to the moment of his confession, the vulnerability he had shown, the raw honesty that had surprised everyone. In the courtroom, for the first time in his career, he wasn't the confident mogul or the smooth-talking businessman. He was just a man standing there, admitting the mistakes he had made. That confession had been his turning point. He had chosen to face his past head-on, but now he was unsure if that was enough to save him. The room fell silent again as the judge began to speak. His words were calm but firm. Mr. Combs, you have admitted to your mistakes, and the jury has recognized your efforts to confront your past. However, this court must also take into account the impact your actions have had on others, the lives that were affected by the choices you made. Diddy felt his heart race as the judge continued. He could feel the tension building again, that sickening knot tightening in his stomach. What would the sentence be? Would the court show him mercy for the person he was trying to become? Or would the consequences be unforgiving? You have committed actions that have damaged your reputation and the trust of others. This court recognizes that you have made efforts to make amends, but it is also clear that the actions you took were not without consequences. The judge said, pausing before delivering the final ruling. The sentence will be determined based on the severity of your actions, but also on the recognition that redemption is a journey It is not a quick fix, but something that must be earned. Did his thoughts race? Redemption, would he ever truly be able to redeem himself in the eyes of the world? Could he rise from this, or had he reached the point of no return? The judge continued doubting the conditions of his sentence. A fine, community service, and probation's weight of the legal consequences was real, but it wasn't a prison. Sentenza there was still a way out, a path forward. Diddy wasn't being completely broken. He was being given a chance to rebuild, a chance to show that he could do better. As the judge finished, Diddy felt their shift. The verdict was harsh, but it wasn't the end. It was a beginning. He was not being destroyed, but reshaped. It would be a long road to repair the damage he had caused, but this wasn't the end of his story. The court had given him a second chance, a chance to prove that the man who stood before them could evolve, could be something better. His defense lawyer gave him a reassuring glance, a silent reminder that this wasn't over. Diddy nodded, but deep down knew that the real work was just beginning. He would have to prove himself, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of the people who had supported him and the ones who had turned their backs. The work to rebuild his reputation, his legacy, was going to be even harder than the battles he had faced in the courtroom. As the courtroom cleared out, Diddy stood up slowly, his mind processing everything that had just happened. The weight of the gavel was still heavy on his shoulders, but there was something different now, a spark of determination, a flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't going to give up. He was going to rebuild piece by piece. He had faced his truth. Now he had to show the world that he could live up to the man he wanted to be. Diddy walked out of the courtroom not with the swagger he had once known, but with acquiescent resolve. He had been through the fire. Now it was time to rise from the ashes. The road ahead was long, and he knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to earn back what he had lost, to show that even a man who had fallen from grace could rise again. The real journey, the one that would define him, was just